Milky Radio. You're listening to Milky Radio. Keep on listening to Milky Radio. News and entertainment. The Proudograms are here for all types of listeners around the world. The Proud Rooms are ranging from news, sports news, documentaries, panel discussion, talk shows, kids programs, and any other programs based on your preferences and at your own convenience.
U.S. Ambassador to Israel makes his final push for release of U.S. hostages from Gaza. On January 10, 2025, we are going to do everything we can in this round to get all the American hostages, living and dead, out. Ambassador Jacob J. Lew tells NPR. His tenure as President Biden's envoy ends this month. The news is presented by Maya Levi and reported by Daniel Estrin. Stay tuned.
The U.S. is seeking the release of all 7 American hostages held in Gaza in the ongoing negotiations for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. That is more than Hamas has said it was prepared to release in negotiations now. But that is what U.S. Ambassador to Israel Jack Lew is pursuing.
We are going to do everything we can in this round to get all the American hostages, living and dead, out.
The top U.S. envoy to Israel is leaving his post in a week before President-elect Trump takes office, and the ambassador spoke to NPR today about his role during the war. NPR's Daniel Estrin met him in Jerusalem.
Ambassador Jack Lew is tall. He'd stand out in a crowd. But sitting in the official residence in Jerusalem, he told us why he's kept a low public profile this past year.
I don't think it was a year when being out having dinner and looking like you were on the town was even appropriate. I was here for 15 months of war.
He arrived a month after the October 7th attacks. His first meeting in the official residence was with the families of U.S. citizens taken hostage by Hamas. Today, he met again with U.S. hostage families. A photo of American hostage Idan Alexander sits on his shelf.
His grandmother gave me that picture and asked me to keep it prominent, and, I can do everything I can in the diplomatic channel, but I can also do it a young man's grandmother asked me to do.
He's a soldier who would not be released in phase 1.
We're trying. We're working hard on his case.
The most high-profile American case was Hersh Goldberg Polin, a 23-year-old American-Israeli hostage killed by his captors in Gaza last summer. Ambassador Lew confirmed they were negotiating his release in the weeks before he was killed.
The fact that he was brutally murdered in cold blood, while his name is actively in a discussion on the release of hostages, kind of shows you what we're dealing with.
One debate among U.S. diplomats has been the U.S. arming Israel and whether Israel took care to limit civilian casualties in Gaza. Lew says Israel generally met the U.S. military's own standards.
When you're fighting an enemy like Hamas that's deliberately hiding its munitions and its command and control operations and its military leaders and fighters behind civilians, it takes extraordinary effort to limit civilian casualties.
How to judge the Biden administration's role in the war? Former U.S. Ambassador to Israel Daniel Kurtzer says it was a mixed legacy, but for the majority of the war, U.S. diplomacy failed.
On the one hand, having supported Israel in the response to October 7th, but having failed to constrain the Israeli military in the destructiveness that it wrought on Gaza.
Ambassador Lew says one of his main successes was getting Israel to allow aid into Gaza.
You heard people saying, not a drop of water, not a drop of milk, not a drop of oil goes into Gaza. So we took what was a closed system that was impenetrable, and through daily engagement, achieved opening up the system.
He said he worked hard to avoid any public rift with Israel, but said he sometimes didn't get the same treatment in return. Like when the U.S. opposed the negotiated with Israel to restrain its invasion of Rafah.
I bridle a little bit when I hear this simple sort of political slogan. They said we couldn't and we did.
You're speaking about when Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke publicly saying we went into Rafah even though we were pressured not to.
For another week, I'm a diplomat, and I think you understood correctly what I meant, but I'm going to leave it at that.
If he's confirmed, the next ambassador will be former Arkansas governor and evangelical minister Mike Huckabee. He is a close ally of Netanyahu. Daniel Estrin, NPR News, Jerusalem.
How these suburban moms in Ukraine manage grief by training to down Russian drones. Let's see the news from Joanna, reported by Joanna Kokakis, and of course read by Oksana Parafinoik on NPR. On January 10, 2025, women from a Kyiv suburb traumatized by a 2022 massacre by Russian troops joined a volunteer air defense unit to take down Russia's drones and deal with their fears.
After nearly 3 years of Russia's war on Ukraine, trauma and grief run deep, especially in the suburbs of Kyiv, where Russian troops massacred civilians in the city of Bucha. A group of women who survived found a way to cope by training to shoot down Russian drones. And a warning before we start, this piece includes mentions of suicide and sexual assault, descriptions of wartime violence, and the sounds of gunshots. NPR's Joanna Kakissis has the story.
In a cold forest outside Kyiv, the suburban moms in army green fatigues assemble their rifles. Valentina trained as a veterinarian. Nina is a math teacher. Tatiana used to be a water inspector. The group also includes a real estate agent, a nanny, a doctor, and a pastry chef. They shoot at targets in a muddy range. Valentina grins after she nails her shot. We call ourselves the combat witches of Bucha, she says. The name comes from a badge one of us had showing a witch with weapons. The name doesn't matter that much, she says. What matters more is belonging to this team and that we are together. The Witches are a female volunteer air defense unit trained to shoot down drones in the suburbs of Kyiv. NPR is not disclosing the women's last names at the request of the Ukrainian military. The women all come from the Kyiv suburbs, where Russian forces killed and tortured residents early in the 2022 invasion. Valentina and her best friend Ina are from a village near the city of Bucha. At a cafe in the city, the two sit side by side. Valentina says they met 11 years ago when their youngest children became friends in kindergarten. She says our kids hung out, we talked, and soon we realized we are cut from the same cloth. When Russian troops occupied the city at the end of February 2022, Valentina and her son crowded into a basement with neighbors. Ina says her family drove to another village, holing up in a tiny old hut owned by her grandparents. It had firewood, a cellar, and potatoes. In a cafe in another Kyiv suburb, Tatiana recalls her experience during the occupation. How hurriedly she packed a suitcase for herself and her two daughters. How her husband, who had joined the military, rushed to embrace her and their girls one last time. She says, "My husband told me, my task is to save our city. Yours is to save our children." A friend took Tatiana and the girls to Spain. Walking along the seaside, Tatiana felt a cold emptiness in her heart.
Коли у мене тоді настрій пропав, душі так, гаденько стало, гадка-гадка.
My husband had not called when he was supposed to, she says. And then, at 3:30 that morning, someone called me and told me he was dead. She asks me to shut off the recorder as her eyes fill with tears. I'm a soldier, she says, and soldiers aren't supposed to cry. The occupation lasted a week. Valentina huddled in the basement. She heard women considering unimaginable choices, like killing themselves and their own children to avoid being raped and tortured by Russian troops. Valentina sent a message to Ina.
Був такий момент дуже тяжкий. Інна,
She told me, if anything happens to me, please take care of my son. Valentina and her family survived the siege. When she and Ina reunited, they burst into tears. Tatiana returned to Ukraine and volunteered to transport supplies to the front line in honor of her husband. But her emotions were raw.
переживала я дуже важко, чесно, я не хочу просто згадувати.
I was going through a very tough time, and honestly, I don't want to talk about it now because I will cry, she says, and you won't be able to calm me down. Meanwhile, over the last year, Russian drone attacks on Ukraine have increased. While scrolling on her phone last summer, Tatiana saw an announcement about a volunteer unit called the Witches of Bucha that shoots down these drones.
Вразилась, їду, в поїзді дивлюся.
And I immediately dialed the number, she says. I got an interview and then the job. Valentina and Ina saw it too and signed up together. We were just sitting and crying at home, and that's no good, Valentina says. And now we've got skills. We know how to hold a gun, how to shoot a gun. Maybe we don't know how to kill the enemy, but that's coming up next. The Witches of Bucha are all close friends now. They call or text each other every day. They meet for coffee, go on vacation together.
It's gonna be explosions.
And every week they're back in the forest outside Kyiv, practicing their drills and patrolling for drones at night. A training drone flies overhead, over trenches and burnt vehicles, remnants of the Russian occupation. The women jump into a truck outfitted with a recoil-operated machine gun called the Maxim, the first fully automatic machine gun in the world. A male soldier helps them practice putting it together. Tatiana says they have not yet shot down any Russian drones.
До нас не залітають.
We haven't had the chance yet, she says. They don't fly over here. We can see them, but they're not in our sector. Taking down drones, she says, is not the only goal for the Witches of Bucha. More importantly, she says, they are taking care of each other, no longer victims, but soldiers. Joanna Kakissis, NPR News, Bucha, Ukraine.
That's the end of the news, guys, for today. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.